ladies and gentlemen. So, two quick two quick statements as we begin. Number one, I just want to have a shout out to a very close friend who is my family's official photographer and videographer. And that would be Mitchell, whose birthday is today. And, he's been a mainstay here as the official photographer for probably, 13 years now almost, maybe 12, 11, something like that. And so all the past JLIs, 3 a year for the last 12 years or so, just about. Mitchell's got somewhere in the deep recesses of his computer's memory. The other thing is I want to dedicate tonight's lesson, which is about loss and grief, actually, surprisingly. We're talking about happiness, and yet one of the greatest impediments, perhaps, to happiness, challenges to our happiness, is suffering a loss. And all kinds of loss can do this, but tonight we're going to focus on the loss of a loved one. And it's obviously a very emotional topic, one that can be very difficult to address. But I want to dedicate this in particular to those families in Israel who lost loved ones just about 2 weeks ago in such a brutal and tragic way. And I hope that at the end of the evening tonight, maybe we'll have some language to articulate something that I find fascinating. Fascinating might be the wrong word. Watching, and we've seen unfortunately so much of this terrible dying that has occurred over the last couple of years in Eretz Yisrael. So many people who have lost loved ones. And yet I never fail to be amazed at the tremendous, and in a certain way unusual response sometimes that you see from the families, the mothers, the families of those people who were killed and who were taken from them. And I'm talking about in particular, on one hand, and I'll give an example. It was a very visible example because they were out in the news a long time. Those 3 boys who were killed before the outbreak of the war in Gaza just this summer. And on one hand, there was a tremendous grief and sadness and loss that each of these families exhibited. And on the other hand, at the very same time, together with all of the loss, there was a certain strength and there's a certain soft and gentle acceptance of the reality of what had occurred, and an acceptance of, in a way that maybe we're not accustomed to. At least for me, it was amazing to hear these mothers speaking and talking. I don't really have words to describe. Amazing isn't the right word. Just something very moving about the way in which they, on one hand, the tremendous sadness, on the other hand, the acceptance at the very same time going on. And hopefully, by the end of the evening tonight, we'll have some language and we'll have some insight and perspective on the Jewish perspective on grief, loss, mourning, dying, and which can help frame how to deal with loss in a way that we should be able to go on with life and to go on with a joyous and happy life. We're physical beings, and physical life is finite. Sooner or later, we face the death of somebody who's near and dear to us. For many, this is a devastating experience. For many who are never the same again, if you will, and after experiencing a loss. Others recover, sometimes after years of melancholy, depression. So we'd like to explore tonight the unique Jewish perspective and approach to this really primary, in many ways, challenge to our happiness. We'd like to talk about a framework and tools that Torah provides us in the writings of our sages to help us with coping and ultimately to return at the right time to our mental and emotional equilibrium and to be able to once again lead a happy, wholesome, healthy existence. By show of hands, if I can ask, how many people in this room have experienced the loss of somebody close to themselves, either a parent, a sibling, a spouse, a child, or a very close friend? How many people have experienced that? So I got to tell you that I approach this class with tremendous humility, in that I, thank God, have not experienced the loss of somebody extremely close to me. The closest was the loss of the Rebbe, who was undoubtedly a very profound influence on my life. And again, there was all of these feelings of loss were there, but not a close family member, thank God. Although I must say that I am, in my sort of official capacity as a rabbi, exposed to this in many ways, perhaps more than others, but not on a personal level. And so hopefully together we can gain some insight in the framing of this issue. So what is we're going to start by comparing and contrasting, really, actually throughout the lesson, some of the common psychological responses to loss, and take a look at how Torah approaches this. So before we talk about the Torah approach, we'd like to begin with what is known today as the very commonly and widely accepted as the 5 stages of grief, which is formulated by the famous psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in her book on death and dying. She originally this is a theory that was introduced in 1969, and it gained widespread acceptance in the field. And it was a study originally that Kubler-Ross did of people who were terminally ill. And she described this at great, she interviewed people and spent time with them and everything. She created this model of people, of the stages that they go through when they find out that they're going to die. It turns out that these same 5 reactions are common to any form of catastrophic loss, such as sometimes a child's reaction to a parent's divorce, God forbid, or people's reaction even to a major financial loss. People go through this. The end of a relationship can have similar connotations. The onset of a chronic illness or disability. And of course, what's relevant to what we're going to be discussing tonight, we're going to focus on the issue of the death of a loved one. Now, it's important to note that these 5 steps that we're about to outline, they don't always happen in linear fashion. It's not like they happen one after the other. They can often be mixed and not in the same order. Some of them take different lengths of time, depending on the person, depending on the circumstance. But almost everybody that they found goes through some form of these 5 stages of grief that are described. So let's briefly go through them in Figure 5.1 on page 154.
Mendel?
Yes?
Just one thing I want to interject, and I think it's kind of important. She wrote a book, which I'm reading right now. It's on grief and grieving. It has to be, I have to mention this because there's the same 5 steps, except the 3rd step, which is bargaining, which people would, we're not talking, right here, we're talking about grieving.
Correct.
So the person who is going
through it goes through the process of bargaining.
Okay, in her book, and this might be, I think it's very important to bring up in this particular discussion if you want to. Instead of bargaining, it's guilt. And I think
I was going to bring it up, but go good.
Guilt is the 3rd step in her book, and if anybody wants to read a really great book, it's by her. She and another writer, because she was dying at the time that the Grief and Grieving was written. And it's a great book, but it is different than this in that the bargaining part is
correct.
There's the guilt is there instead.
Thank you, absolutely. There's the guilt, survivor's guilt for the loved ones around, which is a different type of feeling. But we're going to get into that in a moment. We're not going to spend a lot of time on bargaining actually because of that, but we will go through them. Okay, so let's just very briefly take a look at what these 5 steps are. So the first step, the first stage in grieving is denial. A person is faced with a loss, and actually, I'm going to have somebody read this. Melanie, do you mind?
Not at all. One, denial. Because the reality of loss is hard to face, one of the first reactions is the attempt to shut out the reality or the magnitude of one's situation and to develop a false, preferable reality. 2, anger. The person is overcome with a sense of outrage over what has occurred to him or her. He or she is plagued by the questions, why me? How could God allow this to happen? The anger might be directed at oneself, at God, at the departed loved one, or at those close to oneself, or toward a third party who is seen to blame for the tragedy.
So the first one creates a false reality, in a certain sense, that denial. The second one is almost summed up in the why me, and which with an angry edge to it. Why me? With a lot of anger often in that. Go ahead.
Third is bargaining. The person makes all sorts of bargains with himself or with a higher power in the hope that this can somehow undo the cause of grief.
Okay.
Depression. As the reality of what has occurred sinks in, depression takes hold. My life is over. There is no point in going on. Why bother with anything? The person withdraws into a lonely, paralyzing grief. And fifth is acceptance. The person comes to terms with the tragedy, accepts the new reality, and regains emotional equilibrium.
So I want to just take a minute for a second here, and in our learning exercise 1, let's everybody here, well, almost everybody, the vast majority of those of you sitting here can relate to this in a personal way, some kind of loss that you have experienced personally. So drawing on that experience of mourning, or the passing of a loved one, or being with a close friend or family member who went through that, which of these stages do you believe are beneficial and necessary? You know, it's clear that this is a fact of life that we go through these stages. But now let's take a moment. Which are healthy? Which of these are healthy? If we could have our druthers, which of these are healthy stages, and which of these are, you know, if we could, we would do away with them? Okay, which are beneficial and necessary, which are not beneficial but unavoidable, and simply they need to be allowed to run their course, and which are not beneficial and, in your belief, can be actively overcome or avoided altogether. Okay, so let's take a look at these 3 things. We actually have this over here in this chart. So in the denial one, circle one of the 3, beneficial and necessary, not beneficial but unavoidable, not beneficial and can be avoided or overcome, and the same for anger and depression. Take a minute. We've only chosen these 3 because the point is to come to acceptance. Acceptance is where we want to get to. That's a healthy stage, I think everybody would agree. And the bargaining part we're not going to be discussing because, again, that was written for those who are going through it on their own. Here we're talking about loved ones, which, again, as Stuart mentioned, there's something else, there's guilt, etc. But we're going to focus on these 3 for now. So take a minute, if you will. I'm gonna poll you guys for a comment or 2 on each of these. I'm not going to get to everybody probably, but this is just sort of to get a sense of the feeling here in the room. So is denial beneficial or not, and why? Anybody want to weigh in? Do you think that denial is beneficial or not?
I'll make the argument that all of these stages can be beneficial if they are allowed to be expressed and recognized for what they are.
Okay.
From a mental health standpoint, repressing an emotion that would be any of these is unhealthy.
Okay.
Certainly carried to an extreme, it's obviously unhealthy. But if someone says you're angry and you talk about that, or you're in denial, let's talk about it, that can be very, very therapeutic.
Mm-hmm. what's therapeutic, to be in denial or to be able to talk about being in denial?
Well, obviously, one follows the other. It's okay to be in denial.
Actually,
as long as
actually,
you-
I would argue for a moment that being in denial may mean that you're in denial of being in denial.
Let's talk about it. That would be the response from
Correct.
a mental health professional.
That's the response. You're going a step further now. You're suggesting that we can now understand, take denial, call it what it is, and deal with it. But we're talking now from the person who's going through it. Is denial intrinsically a healthy response, a good response? It's something we want to nurture?
It's a natural response.
Agreed. Okay, I'm not going to get an answer for you.
Okay.
I hear you. Go ahead.
I'll say it can even be a good response if it's a defense against falling apart completely and keeps the person going.
Okay, and that's what it is. It's a defense against falling apart completely often. And so, in that regard, it's a good response. Anybody else want to weigh in? Yes, last comment on this.
So I would argue that it's probably unavoidable, but I don't know that I see it as totally beneficial. I agree with everything else everybody said, but I think if you look at the three for me, I just feel like that one, it may be unavoidable because I think we all go through that, but I'm not sure it really helps. I think you have to get through it quickly.
Okay. So it's something that we'd like, that's a stage we want to get through and overcome. Good. Let's go to the next one for a minute. Is anger beneficial or not, and why? Anybody? And we have the general statement that all of these are beneficial, necessary, natural, etc. Anybody? Is anger good or not? Go ahead.
Wouldn't anger depend on the situation which caused the tragedy?
Okay, if you'd
If
like
it was
to...
like if it was a bad accident or something like that, I would feel very angry about that.
Okay. So you feel, so then, given the right circumstances, anger is a good, healthy emotion?
Yeah.
Okay. Rhonda?
I say it's not beneficial, but it's not.
Not beneficial, but unavoidable. Good. Janine?
Okay, so I don't think it's beneficial, and I'm not so sure that it's completely unavoidable.
Okay. You think that anger can somehow be, we can work on that part, and we'll talk, and any idea how it might be avoided or overcome?
Well, I mean, we've had like, 5 lessons before this that at least touched in some areas, but not necessarily to the degree of the situation like I think we're touching on today.
Good. So we touched on it, perhaps we touched on it briefly, but hopefully tonight we're going to touch on it more. Last, yes,
I don't
Dr. Redmond.
necessarily see that the anger is anger in the way that we normally think about it. I'm so angry I'm going to throw this glass up against the wall. It's a questioning phase. And we all ask questions, whether it's a catastrophic thing or whether it's something that happened just the other day to me. I said, well, why couldn't I do that? It wasn't really anger, but it's a question, and you sort of have to question it. That may be that's an automatic reaction to something, and I think it's something you have to work through, and it may be necessary for you to actually get to the next stage.
Okay. Okay. Yes, Stuart.
But I think, first of all, the anger, you can't categorize it. You can't say it's unavoidable. First of all, that's not true. Not everybody's angry. But, and also, you can't say denial is unavoidable because not everybody's in denial. So it's nice to say it's unavoidable, but it's not. Not everybody has it. The anger, you have people pass away for different reasons. If God forbid you had a relative who was in that Jerusalem synagogue, you're really angry. You're angry at what happened. If God forbid something happens to them and it's...
That's what Marcus was saying earlier.
So that's all. And as far as, like I say, the denial, but I think that the depression is something, I think, again, in her book, where she writes about it, is that she actually says that depression is not only necessary, but it's the way the mind slows down a little bit. If you keep going at this pace that you are all the time, you can't necessarily comprehend what you're going through. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross says that it's something that is nature's way of protecting us. You know, it's not the clinical depression that we
Generally think of.
yeah, we generally, it's not, so when you see depression.
Although, by the way, although it can be, it definitely can lead there.
It can lead there, but if you take the normal progression of somebody who's lost somebody close, then this depression, according to her, is beneficial and is necessary.
Okay, good.
temporarily while you're, but if you get caught or stuck in a stage, that's when it becomes harmful.
Good. Excellent. Okay, so these are realities of life as we've heard, and they are, this is the general way in which we relate. And one thing is for sure that this is how we are naturally wired. There's enough study, there's enough information out there that this is the way we naturally deal with issues of loss. So, a significant component of sometimes of the distress over the loss of a loved one can often be a feeling of outrage at the injustice of it. And so for a moment here, I want to discuss a number of texts from a Jewish perspective that talk about and respond to this particular aspect of grieving having to do with the outrage or the anger element that comes along. So we're going to bring two readings. Yes?
Was there some kind of a more correct answer or not?
No, there's no correct answer. I wanted to just hear and get a feel for what there is. There's no right or wrong answer. So we're going to take two stories. These stories are a little bit far out, but I want to, and some of these stories have been used. We've studied these. Those who have been people coming to the JLI often. Some of these stories are used because they're both famous stories. But when we finish, we're going to examine these stories a little bit and try to take some insight as to why the Talmud tells us as it does, and why in the book of Job, the second story, why it's written the way it is and what we can learn from it. So if somebody will, Alex, you're right in front of me, if you don't mind, page 157, text 1.
It happened that one Shabbat afternoon while Rabbi Meir was lecturing at the study hall, his two sons died. What did their mother, Berea, do? She laid them on the bed and covered them with a sheet. After Shabbat, Rabbi Meir arrived from the study hall and said to her, "Where are my two sons?" She said to him, "They went to the study hall." Said he to her, "But I looked in the study hall and I did not see them." She handed him a cup of wine for Havdalah. After reciting Havdalah, he again asked, "Where are my two sons?" Said she to him, "They went to a particular place and will soon return." She served him dinner. After he recited the grace after meals, she said, "My teacher, I have a question to ask." Said he to her, "Ask." Said she to him, "Before today, someone left an item with me for safekeeping, and he has now come to collect it. Shall we return the item or not?" Said he to her, "My daughter, is it not a custodian required to return the deposit to its master?" She said to him, "My teacher, if not for your words, I would not have brought myself to return it." What did she do next? She grasped his hand, led him up to that room, brought him near to the bed, and removed the sheet from over them. When he saw the two of them lying dead upon the bed, he began to weep, saying, my children, my teachers, meaning my children in the natural sense, and my teachers who enlightened my eyes with the words of Torah." At that moment she said to him, "Rabbi Meir, my teacher, did you not tell me that we are required to return the deposit to its master? God has given and God has taken." With these words she consoled him, and his mind was eased and settled.
Okay, this is in many ways, it's a mind-blowing story in that how can somebody react that way? And you're talking about the same day, a mother, two children. It's mind-blowing. But I want to examine for a moment, or I want to comment on a couple points here. There's not a lot of time we're running a little late, and I want to make sure that we have a chance to get through everything. So I'm just going to make a few comments on some of the statements that are here. And I want to compare for a moment some parts of Bruria's response, the mother's response, and Rabbi Meir's response. So one of we'll put it in terms of sort of traits maybe that we can learn from. So one of the advantages of Rabbi Meir's response is that he actively grieves for his children. He weeps. He extols their virtues, my children, my teachers. we'll see later in the lesson that both of these responses, both of these ideas, both of active grieving, as well as extolling the sort of the greatness, their virtues, are both very, very important components in how the Torah describes mourning. And we'll talk about why in a moment. One of the advantages, or a couple of the advantages of Bruria's reaction, is that Bruria reframes what happened. She reframes her children's death in a way that it mitigates the injustice of the loss of a child that usually would be, again, that anger, that rage and everything. She has found a way for herself and for her husband to reframe this in terms of a deposit and returning something that was never mine, returning it back to its original owner. Again, it's hard to imagine somebody being able to do this in the compressed time frame and everything, but it's a perspective. The Talmud here is giving us a sense, a perspective, a different way, or a reframed way in which to look at loss. In the story, these two responses are experienced by two different people. They're two different characters. There's Meir, who expresses the tremendous grief, and he's weeping, etc. And then there's his wife, who is reframing, who's actively reframing and talking about life as being entrusted and a trust from God. And the truth is that, as we're going to see, a person can experience both of these things simultaneously. A person can have tremendous grief on one hand, and at the very same time, and while grieving, is able to, as we'll talk about in a moment, to reframe at the same time, to separate the two things. To grieve on one hand, while at the very same time reframing and having a perspective of being entrusted with a deposit that was never mine, etc., as Bruria does. And we're going to talk about this as we go on. And finally, I'll say, maybe to put it in these words, there are, of the different elements of grief, there are two major elements. There's a sadness, and there's a unsettled, there's an agitation, a very deep agitation, an inability to feel settled when one is grieving and mourning. Sadness comes from being deprived of the love and the joy that we derived, if you will, from the relationship with the departed. Agitation, perhaps, comes from, in a certain sense, this inability to accept a new reality. Something has changed. Something profound has changed. The world is not the same. And there's an inner sort of inability to come to terms with a new reality, which causes an internal sort of agitation and unsettledness. So, we're going to suggest here that Bruria's words sort of address what she's trying to do, is trying to address both aspects of Reb Meir's grief. Sort of consoling his sadness, as you see at the end, the last line, she says, with these words, the Talmud finishes, with these words she consoled him, and his mind was eased and settled. What she was trying to do was both console his sadness, and we'll see later on how that is, and also sort of easing and settling his agitation and inner turmoil so that he could now accept, or begin to accept, a new reality. In this passage that we read, Bruria's final words to her husband is God has given and God has taken. Now, we hear this very often at funerals. Hashem Nosan, Hashem Lokach, and we always hear the rabbi say, Yehi Shem Hashem Mevorach. God has given, God has taken, may the name